The story of gladiators are one of the most iconic and fascinating parts of the ancient Roman Empire. I believe that most people have a pretty good understanding thanks to popular movies, books, or even history that still stand today. We don't quite know everything about these fierce warriors. So today, we're going to go over 10 things that you probably didn't know about gladiators. Gladiator fights were originally part of funeral ceremonies. The origin behind gladiatorial fights is kind of a mystery, but nowadays many historians actually agree these kind of fights got their start as a blood right stage at the funerals of wealthy nobles. When distinguished people passed away, their families would hold graveside fights between slaves or prisoners as a kind of dark and twisted eulogy. Romans also believed that human blood helped to purify the deceased souls, so these fights may have also acted as a substitute for human sacrifices. These games later increased in scope during the reign of Julius Caesar, and he held a fight between hundreds of gladiators in honor of his father and daughter. This game proved to be so popular, the government actually began to host state-funded games as a way of incurring favor with the masses. They weren't always slaves. Despite what the movies might show, not all gladiators were brought in the arena in chains and forced to fight against their will. Granted, most of the early combatants were conquered people or slaves who had committed crimes, but by the first century, the thrill of battle and the roar of the crowds just proved to be too intoxicating. Hundreds, thousands of free men began voluntarily signing contracts with gladiatorial schools in the hope of winning glory and all that prize money. These freelance fighters tended to be ex-soldiers or men down to their luck, but members of the upper class, even senators, entered the arena in order to demonstrate their skill and prowess. They didn't always fight to the death. If we were also to go off the movies, it would seem like gladiatorial matches were just bloody free-for-alls or fights to the death. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, most of the fighters operated under a fairly strict set of rules and regulations. Fights were typically between two men of similar size and experience. They had a referee overseeing the action, like the MMA fights of today. The match would usually end when one of the gladiators was severely wounded, but that could also end in a stalemate if it was too long and drawn out, getting boring for the audience. On the other hand, there was the rare occasion where both fighters were allowed to leave the arena of honor they had put on an exciting show for the crowd. The reason why gladiators didn't fight to the death is that they were too expensive. Just all about that money. They had to train, house, and feed these gladiators. No one wanted to see them die after one match. It's also possible that fighters were actually trained to wound, not to kill, and took it upon themselves to avoid it seriously hurting their brothers in arms. However, gladiators still did die in record numbers. Most didn't live past their mid-20s. At least 1 in 10 fights ended with someone dead. The famous thumbs down gesture probably didn't mean death. If a gladiator was severely wounded in a fight or threw down the weapon in defeat, their fate was now left in the hands of the spectators, with the emperor having the final say whether the gladiator lived or died. Movies often show the crowd giving a thumbs down gesture to one of the defeated gladiator to be killed, but that might not necessarily be the case. In fact, odds are it was the exact opposite, with the sign for death actually being a thumbs up, accompanied by cries of slay him. They were organized in different classes and types. Just like the different weight classes in fighting today, gladiators were also organized in different classes based upon their record, skill level, and experience. They also had different gladiatorial types, specializing in a particular fighting style or weaponry. The most popular ones who fought with a sword and shield. Also, gladiators fought on horseback, battled from chariots, or even wielded 2 swords at once. Perhaps the most unique gladiator type were the ones who fought with a net and trident, where they tried to ensnare their opponents with a net, then follow up with a strike from the trident. They only rarely fought against animals. The Colosseum and their arenas did see a lot of animals in the ring, but they rarely ever fought against true gladiators. The animal hunts were reserved for the Venators, who were a special class of warrior that squared off against everything from deer and ostriches, all up to lions, crocodiles, bears, and even elephants. Then while most animals in the ring were reserved for the hunts, others were trained to do tricks or even pitted against each other in a fight. Then, of course, they were a popular form of execution, with criminals and Christians being fed to ravenous dogs, lions, or bears. Women also fought as gladiators. Female slaves were regularly condemned to the arena alongside their male counterparts, but some women actually voluntarily took up the sword of their own free will. Granted, they weren't taken as seriously as the men. Sometimes they were actually pitted against dwarfs. But some women stood above the throng and proved themselves in single combat. There were famous women gladiators like Amazon and Achillea, who fought to an honorable draw against one another. Some gladiators organized into trade unions. Though they regularly fight against one another, gladiators actually viewed themselves as kind of a brotherhood, with some even organizing into unions with their own elected leaders. Whenever a warrior fell in battle, these groups would make sure the fallen would receive a proper funeral and an inscription honoring his achievements in the arena. If the man had a wife and children, also make sure that the family received monetary compensation for their loss. Several Roman emperors participated in staged fights. Hosting gladiator games was an easy way for Roman emperors to win the love of the people, but a few took it a step further and actually participated in combat themselves. However, most of these fights were either staged or fought with dull blades. Emperor Commodus would try and wow the crowds by killing bears and panthers with a spear from his raised platform. He also participated in a few fights too, although they were always against inexperienced fighters or even terrified and poorly armed members of the audience. Gladiators also became celebrities and sex symbols. Though we don't really think about it today, Roman gladiators were essentially the celebrities of their day, won massive fame amongst the lower classes. Their portraits were hung up in many public places. Children played with gladiator action figures made out of clay. The most successful fighters even endorsed products like the top athletes today. Also very popular with the ladies, with many women wearing jewelry dipped in gladiator blood, or even mixed gladiator sweat in their makeup and facial cream. So there you have it. Those are 10 things that you probably didn't know about gladiators. Sound off in the comments down below. Also, be sure to like and subscribe button for more videos just like this one every single week.